host, and let me begin by welcoming you all to this very important ancillary meeting, the decade of the Bangkok Rules, advancements, challenges, and opportunities. This event has been made possible thanks to the joint organization of TLJ, the Penal Reform International, and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, all of which have been our strong partner over the years. Now, let me briefly give you a short bio of TLJ, as some of you might not be familiar. We are a semi-public organization established by the government of Thailand almost 10 years ago, immediately following the adoption of the UN Bangkok Rules. And one of our important mandates is to promote the implementation of these very important standards and norms with respect to the gender-sensitive treatment of women offenders in the criminal justice system and beyond. And also, I would like to give a very brief housekeeping announcement so that we all have a common understanding on how we should proceed. Our session is 90 minutes long. We will have presentations from 6 speakers. 4 of them are here with us live from 3 different continents. 2 have already sent us a pre-recorded video message that we will be happy to share, but they will not be able to entertain questions. Each speaker will have 12 to 15 minutes to make their presentation. Then we hope to be able to entertain a question for about 20 minutes at the end of the presentation. Now, important announcement about how to ask questions. I am informed that there are 2 methods. Either you can raise your hand using the raise hand emoji on the upper left corner of the player, which will allow you to receive a pop-up message informing you that you have been invited to speak. By clicking yes, then you will be allowed to take the floor. The alternate way to ask questions is to type them in your question in the questions tab. This is located on the right-hand side of your window. It is the second tab from the top. And we would love that if more than one person are interested in the same question, you can second tab. You can ask the question so that we'll know that that particular question attracts attention from more than one participant, and we will try to allocate enough priority so that we can have them taken care of. The answers cannot be typed out, so once they have been raised, I will ask the speakers to answer them verbally. Also, I have been actually informed that as viewers, you are not allowed to take the floor, but there is a chat tab on the right side of your screen so that you can use that to communicate with us. Also, for this ancillary meeting, all the documents, including the detailed bios of each speaker, can be found in the right-hand side and in the last tab entitled Files. Also, a recording of this meeting will be made available to the public on our website, TLJ. And that's it for the housekeeping announcement. Let me begin by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Kittipong Kittiyarat, former Executive Director of Thailand Institute of Justice, who will be sharing with us his introductory remarks. Dr. Kittipong has long been involved in the judicial and criminal justice reform in Thailand over the years. He has been known as one of the champions for the reform of the Thai criminal justice system towards a more due process and the rule of law. He has been a pioneer in the implementation of several important initiatives, including restorative justice and community justice in Thailand. He has served various important offices, including a 6-year term as the permanent Secretary of Justice, and then another 6 very fruitful years as the Executive Director of Thailand Institute of Justice. He, of course, is one of those few who have been with the long process of international campaign to rally support toward the cause of women offenders that results in the Bangkok Rules. So I'm very happy that he can share with us not only his vast experience but personal account so that we can have a perspective as to the beginning of our journey so that we will be able to reflect upon the progress made over the 10 years and look forward to the future advance and future ahead of us. Without further ado, Dr. Kittipong Chera, sir, you may have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Piset. Distinguished colleagues, esteemed panelists, ladies and gentlemen, greeting from Bangkok. It brings me great pleasure to be here today as we commemorate the 10th anniversary of the historic United Nations rule for the treatment of women prisoners and non-custodial measures for women offenders, also known as the Bangkok Rules. The UN Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice has been a key vehicle for bringing to the foreground criminal justice reform. It has been a platform for discussing and debating policies and practices using a multi-stakeholder critical lens. And while the way we are all experiencing the Crime Congress this year is unique, the spirit still remains the same. We have all adapted to this new way of life, and I'm very proud to virtually be here today to discuss a very important issue with my fellow expert panelists and participants from around the world. 21st December 2010 was significant because it marked the day the United Nations General Assembly officially recognized the gender-specific needs of women prisoners. It is indeed an important milestone in the international recognition of women's rights. It was my privilege to be part of this global movement and lead Thailand's delegation through several discussions and negotiation process during 2008 to 2010 as the Permanent Secretary of Justice of Thailand at that time. The journey toward the adoption of the Bangkok Rules begins as a local initiative in Thailand. Back in 2006, Her Royal Highness Princess Pacharakitayapa initiated the Kamlang Chai project, or the Inspire project in English, to support women prisoners in Thailand, particularly pregnant women and children living with their mothers in prison. Her passion for this issue led to the project being presented at the 17th session of the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice in Vienna in 2008. That led to a long process of negotiation, after which the Bangkok Rules came into existence. The drafting process was a joint effort of member states, international organizations, and civil society around the world, and the rules were drafted based on good practices and correctional advancements in different regions. In 2011, the Thailand Institute of Justice, or TIJ, was born to promote the implementation of the Bangkok Rules and carry forward the agenda of furthering gender-responsive crime prevention and criminal justice through research, capacity building, and policy advocacy. The past 10 years have made it evident that prison reform is intricately connected not only to justice reform, but also to wider societal reform. We cannot improve the life of incarcerated women without removing the barrier between the inside and outside world. We need drastic change in the way society perceives and interacts with the justice system. Opinions around the purpose of imprisonment and the character of those who have been to prison need to change. And this will only be possible if we involve all sections of society in our efforts to reshape the criminal justice system. Collaboration is a key component to ensure that we collectively shift from a punitive to a more rehabilitative approach to justice. Today, the panelists will be highlighting their experiences of advocating for the Bangkok Rules in different parts of the world. TIJ, as a UN Program Network Institute, has also contributed to this momentum in the ASEAN region. In Cambodia, we partner with the Directorate General of Prisons to pilot the implementation of the Bangkok Rules in the largest women prison. In Indonesia, TIJ trained 38 heads of women's prisons on the Bangkok Rules. And this year, we are planning to deliver a training for prison staff in Malaysia. In Thailand, we gear our work towards promoting collaborative approach and communities' involvement to ensure successful social integration of women prisoners. For instance, TIJ, in collaboration with a university, the private sector, and the Department of Corrections, recently launched the Hygiene Street Food Project, which aims to provide employment opportunities by giving them training, equipment, and capital to kickstart their food business. We also work with over 50 local experts to deliver holistic pre-release programs for women prisoners focusing on mental empowerment, family relations, financial literacy, and career planning. All these efforts were guided by the principle of the Bangkok Rules. But as we all know, this isn't enough. We still have a long way to go. The population of women in prison is still on the rise. Women are still being imprisoned for petty crimes and continue to experience marginalization once released. As we look toward the Bangkok Rules for the next 10 years, we need to go beyond the Bangkok Rules as mere guidelines to increase gender sensitivity in prisons and use them as a springboard to advocate for greater justice policy reform. Finally, I believe that we have seen both success and failures in the implementation of the Bangkok Rules over the past 10 years. In moving forward, it is important that we prioritize and invest in the use of non-custodial measures and ensure that prison sentence is only applied when absolutely necessary. Also, we have to do more to consciously create greater synergies with our stakeholders and to work harder both inside and outside the wall to make prison not an end in itself, but a means to a second chance at life for people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kittikong, for your introductory remarks and for sharing with us your historical perspective, but more also the way forward and also the very fair assessment of the 10 years journey that we have been involved in working to promote the implementation of the Bangkok Rules. Now, with that put into perspective, I think we are ready to begin our discussion that will be able to paint a more detailed and accurate picture of what has been ongoing in different parts of the world. Let me begin with the African region. And we have with us Ms. Doreen Kayazi, the African Program Manager of the Penal Reform International, to share with us the implementation of Bangkok Rules in Africa. Ms. Doreen is the PRI Africa Program Manager with over 14 years experience in human rights advocacy in East Africa. She has been served as project manager and legal expert on a number of human rights projects in Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda, including death penalty campaign, promotion of gender-sensitive sentencing, alternatives to imprisonment, torture prevention, and prison reform. Ms. Doreen is also a member of the Uganda Law Society and Federation of Uganda Women Lawyers. Ms. Doreen Kayazi, we have 12 to 15 minutes for your presentation. Now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Kayazi. Please.
Thank you very much, Speaker. Hello? All protocol observed. I don't see the slides. My presentation is on African perspective on the implementation of the Bangkok Rules.
We can see the slides on our end.
Nick, can you go on slide 1, please? Yes, as we see in all the countries in Africa where we work and others, we've realized an increase in the number of women. That's a period between 2016 and 2020. And we looked at the analysis of just 4 countries, Uganda, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. And as we see, there's been a significant increase in the number of women in all the countries, with the largest records recorded during the COVID-19 pandemic. So a number of women have entered into the system during the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. Of course, women, like the rest of the world, women continue to be fewer than men, comprising of only about 0.8 and 8.2, with varying percentages per country. For example, Rwanda, it's 7.4, Uganda, it's 5%, and Kenya is about 6.7% of the entire prison population. In all the countries, there are higher proportions. The number of women in countries varies between the Commonwealth countries and the Francophone countries, with Francophone countries registering higher percentages of women in detention. And most of the women, given the fact that they are fewer in number, in most of the countries in Africa, the prisons for the women are located very far from their homes. So a couple of them, several women are actually imprisoned far from their homes. And because of the restricted, also the fewer number of prisons, and a couple of them find themselves in mixed prisons. The congestion in the women's prisons is over 100% in most of the countries. And a large number of women in most of the countries, except a few like Uganda, but most of the countries, Kenya, Nigeria, you find that the majority of women offenders are actually civil debtors, which accounts for about 12 to 16.3 accounting for 12 of the total prison population in most of the countries. HIV/AIDS prevalence is highest among the women. For example, in a study conducted in one of the countries in Africa, 24.2% of the HIV patients were women, compared to the 14.4% of the men. There are over 50% of women in detention are awaiting trial. They're actually not yet sentenced. There are very few of those who are convicted prisoners, some of whom are capital offenders, but majority are minor offenders. And we also have civil debtors, as well as women who are considered to be civil lunatics and or criminal lunatics in most of the countries. Next slide, please. From a study conducted by PRI and our partners, we've learned that majority of the women in detention and those in conflict with the law are poor or very poor. Majority of the women are illiterate and have had only up to primary level education. Most women were in some sort of employment, blue collar jobs before imprisonment, market vendors, subsistence farmers, or house helps. So many of them are low income earners. From the study, we also learned that majority of the women who get in contact with the law, 97% are mothers, and a few of them, a number of them have experienced violence and discrimination, including female genital mutilation and early marriages. Most of the women have low understanding of the law, which explains why many of them go through the system without any sort of any defense, put forward. And majority lack legal representation. And this is also aligned to the number because of they are fewer than men. Africa has made a little bit of progress towards the implementation of the Bangkok Rules. With respect to Rules 2 and 4, which are talking about admission, registration, and allocation, there are a number of reception boards that have been established in most of the countries, comprising of the officers in charge, medical officers, social workers, and other officers in vocational programs. We also have, they've been also established prison rules as where prisoners can seek help in most of the countries. There are human rights desks, for example, in Uganda, which have both prisoners and also staff human rights desks. PRI supported the drafting of a couple of handbook materials which to guide the management of women offenders. And there's been support offered to the women, especially refugee communities, refugee women in detention, access the consular offices once they are in detention. Next slide, please. Under Rule 5, we've seen increasing commitment from the government to provide sanitary towels, to extend water to most of the female prisons. Boreholes have been constructed in dry areas and water tanks have been put up for in cases of droughts. Disinfectants are also supplied to most of the prisons. The challenge, however, is that there are inadequate washing facilities, and also you find that in most of the prisons, particularly those in remote areas, water is yet to be connected or accessed. Although sanitary towels are provided, they are still inadequate, not sufficient for the women for the duration of the period, and there is also inadequate supply of uniforms in most of the countries. You find that women have, on average, 1-2 uniforms. Some countries have a comprehensive, under Rules 6 to 8, there's also been progress in some countries in development of comprehensive programs on screening, counseling, and treatment of inmates. For example, in Zambia, access to hospitals within the prisons and local health centers where the particular prison has no in-house hospital. There's also been periodic psychosocial support extended to women. This is mostly done by NGOs like PRI, PRAWA, countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and Uganda. And also some countries have started programs on drug abuse prevention and awareness programs. For example, in Nigeria, that was started, and in Kenya. The challenge, however, is that in most of the women prisons, there are no station medical workers, like nurses, midwives, social workers. You find that they rely on the social workers allocated to men's prisons. There's also a generally inadequate availability of rehabilitation programs for the women in prisons. And now with the pandemic, with the COVID-19 pandemic, women prisons have been forgotten in terms of accessing PPEs. Next, please. Most women in prisons run and are managed by female staff, and so that's in line with Rule 19 and 21. And in most of the countries, searches are also conducted by female. However, there's no proper training of staff on how to conduct these searches. Intrusive searches continue, and modern screening technology is yet to be adopted in Africa, in most of the countries. Next, please. Under Rules 26 to 28, we find that family visits are now allowed in most of the countries. There is an open door policy for most of the prison systems. Open days have now been initiated and established in some countries, and some of the prisons are open prisons. For example, in Kenya, there is the remote parenting program, which allows women to meet with their children at least quarterly to continue with, understanding on the progress in education and other factors. And also, Nigeria and Kenya welcome public into the prisons to understand what the conditions are. The women have access to phones in most of the countries. For example, Uganda and Senegal, you can the social workers who are usually in charge of the phones, which can be given to the women. Under this rule, however, there's been some challenges, including the fact that The fact that most of the women are detained far from their homes and most of them from the poor strata of the society, most of their families are unable to visit them in prison. So many of them spend their time in detention without any visitation, largely because the relatives cannot afford. In some countries, funds are prohibited. And the fact that women are collectively, most of the women are mixed. There is no possibility of classification because the women are few in number. So minors and capital offenders are all in the same prisons. Next, please. Next, please. Hello? Oh my God. Hello? Can anyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Barbara, can we go on to the next slide, please? I will continue because I don't know if the control room cannot hear me, but let me just continue. Yeah, in relation to rules 48, 49, and 64, in most of the countries, supplementary food and vegetables are given to pregnant women, mothers, and those suffering from HIV and AIDS. Some countries have vegetable gardens and others have like animals within the prison settings, which provide milk to the babies and the mothers and as well as the pregnant women. Nurseries for infants have been established in some countries. For example, Kenya and Uganda have set up nurseries for the babies in prison. The children are separated. In most of the countries, children are separated from their mothers upon attaining an average age of 4 years. However, some children sometimes remain in prison for longer than that because of lack of this inability to find anyone willing to take on the children in detention. While the children may remain in prisons, at least there is effort from the administrations to ensure that the children can access education and so leave prison at a certain time to go to school. There is inadequate supply of medicines, particularly for the infants in most of the countries, the infants of women in detention who are incarcerated together with their parents. And also, even if there is effort to improve the availability of nutritious food, in most of the countries, this is still very, very inadequate. Most countries lack nurseries and units for mothers with infants. So even if mothers are in prisons, they're still mixed up with others, which is a risk to both to the children. Under Rule 56, guidelines have been developed at by the African Commission on Arrest, Police Custody, and Pretrial Detention in Africa. And these guidelines provide for the separation of women from men and also sets various standards regarding conducting of searches on women during pretrial. There's also effort in developing policies against torture. For example, Uganda and Kenya and Ghana have policies against torture. There's been gender policies and guidelines on the management of women in prisons in in some countries like Uganda and Kenya. However, like I mentioned earlier, women continue to be mixed with men, particularly at police cells and prisons. This has escalated during the COVID-19 pandemic because of the delayed court sessions. Custodial measures have been put in place in countries, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, and sentencing guidelines have been developed. Challenge is that the attitude towards alternatives to detention remains very poor, and there's inadequate resources to adequately implement non-custodial measures, and also preference for custodial sentences in most of the countries. Next, please. Next, please. However, there are several opportunities that I think are important for us as on the African continent to take forward towards the implementation of the rules. One is the adoption by the African Commission of Article 30 African Charter, which provides for special treatment of pregnant women and mothers, and state parties to always consider non-custodial sentences for primary caregivers. There's also been new laws that have been enacted in most of the countries against the use of domestic violence, as well as policies. National development plans have also increasingly provided the need for gender mainstreaming and capacity building, as well as research. Already research has been conducted by various NGOs like PRI, has provided research with the support of the EU and TIJ on various issues related to the women's, which will provide evidence on policy development. Next, please. Next, please. Thank you very much. That is all from me.
Thank you very much, Doreen, for a very comprehensive presentation. Please accept our apologies for the technicality issue that may have arisen during your presentation, but you are doing great, just 15 minutes on time, give and take. And I would like to also ask the panelists to bear with us while we are coping with the technicality of this. I understand that you may encounter some delay and some mishap. For instance, I myself forgot to introduce myself, but allow me to do so. I'm Piset Saachen, the Executive Director of the Thailand Institute of Justice. Very pleased to be with you today. Now, the situation in Africa seems to be a mixed bag, both some progress made by authorities, but I perceive that there are still a lot of challenges in many aspects, infrastructures, mindsets, and everything. Also, I have been given the note to speak louder, so another apology. I will try to be more vocal. Without further ado, I would like to now move on to our next speaker, who would be sharing with us the European situation, Mr. Rob Allen. Let me give a brief introduction to him. Rob Allen is an independent researcher and consultant on criminal justice and prisons. Rob was director of the International Center for Prison Studies at the King's College London from 2005 to 2010, and since then he has undertaken a number of projects for the UNODC, including the drafting of the important handbook on the roadmap for prison-based rehabilitation in 2017. Rob has also undertaken research and training assignments for the Penal Reform International, and he was the contributing writer for the Global Prison Trends Report for the year 2015 and 2016. I am very pleased to have Rob with us today. Now I would like to give him the floor.
Thank you very much, Fizit, and good morning to everybody from London. It's a great honor to have the chance to contribute to this important meeting. The Bangkok Rules are a very important milestone in prison reform, one of the most important during my career, certainly, and along with the Nelson Mandela Rules, they have really made a substantial contribution to improving the normative framework for prisons and non-custodial sentences. Personally, I would like to see the Tokyo rules, which govern non-custodial sentences, also revised in the coming period. I think they're now 30 years old, and we know a lot more about non-custodial penalties, but perhaps that's for the next Congress. I want to use my time to briefly cover 5 areas. Next slide, please, Pratana. A little bit about the trends in the use of prison in Europe, the framework of rules that we have in the European region, something briefly about the European Court of Human Rights, and then to end with a couple of challenges and good practices. And what I say will be based in part on a couple of pieces of work I've done, evaluations of prison reform projects undertaken with funds from the Norwegian government, the Norway Grants Programme, and also an evaluation of the work of the Council of Europe, which has not yet been published, but I will say something about the Council of Europe, which is the organisation that has 47 member states and produces rules and collects statistics. And the statistics show women represent about 5% of people in prison in the European region, ranging from nearly 8% in Russia down to 2% in Albania, and about 10% of people on probation who are serving supervised non-custodial penalties are women. So a slightly higher proportion of women are involved in probation. Next slide. Obviously, it's impossible to generalize about the trends in prison population, but over the last 10 years, just for some examples, in terms of bigger countries on the left, we see Russia, which has really reduced the number of women in prison substantially. And on the right, on the right-hand side of the left graph, Turkey, which has almost doubled the number of women in prison. This is over the last 10 years. If we look at medium-sized countries on the right-hand graph, we've got the UK on the left, which has seen a fall in the number of women over the last 10 years. And in other countries, Germany, it's increased. And Italy and Poland, well, fell a bit in the middle part of the decade and then has risen. And the next slide, please, Pratana, which shows some smaller countries, Bulgaria, Greece, Norway, Lithuania, which have seen falls in the number of women. Is there any kind of conclusion we can draw? I think looking at the figures, Eastern European countries have shown a decline, a reduction, a welcome reduction in the number of women in prison over the last 10 years. And the picture in Western Europe is more mixed. And I think also that to a large extent, the trends in women in prison have rather followed the overall trends in the prison population. So Russia, for example, which has seen this big fall in the numbers, it has seen a big fall in the numbers of prisoners across the board. And I think an assessment that was made a couple of years ago suggested that the trends in Europe for women do tend to follow the wider trends in prison populations. Next slide, please, Pratana. So we have had last year a revision to the European prison rules, which were first introduced in 2006, and they include a rule calling for specific gender-sensitive policies to be developed. And obviously this is very welcome and shows the influence of the Bangkok Rules, I think. And the rules also include the requirement to pay attention to the physical, vocational, social and psychological needs of women and to protect them from abuse. So very much in line with what the Bangkok Rules have been arguing for. But, next slide, please. There is a question about whether the European prison rules go far enough. So in the commentary to the rules, It says the Council of Europe say the Bangkok Rules include comprehensive guidance on the treatment of women prisoners. There is no direct European equivalent to them. Furthermore, the CPT, which is the Committee for the Prevention of Torture, which is a monitoring body that the Council of Europe has established to visit member states and to report on places of detention. The CPT has said the time is ripe for the Council of Europe to develop specific rules for women in detention, building on the UN 2010 Bangkok Rules. On the right-hand side of this slide, there is a standard that the CPT have themselves produced called Women in Prison in 2018, which goes some way to producing some norms in this area. But in my opinion, there is a gap here. In the European region, we haven't gone far enough, and there is a need for member states of the Council of Europe to produce more detailed rules in this area. Next slide, please. The Council of Europe itself has a strong policy of gender mainstreaming, and last year, I think, or 2019, produced a guide for the projects that the Council of Europe works with. It has a number of technical cooperation projects designed to help member states comply with international norms. It has produced a good guidebook on gender mainstreaming, which includes a section on gender equality in the penitentiary system. So the Council of Europe has been active in this area, but I think there is more work that could be done. Next slide, please. The European Court of Human Rights, all members of the Council of Europe sign up to the European Convention on Human Rights, which has a number of articles, including Article 14, which deals with the question of discrimination. All of the rights and freedoms under the Convention must be enjoyed without discrimination. And so a number of cases have come up in front of the court in which people have argued that because special arrangements are in place for women, so they should be in place for men. There have been some important cases which have said that that's not necessarily the case. So prison sentences can be deferred for mothers in some countries, but not fathers. And the European Court has said that that is perfectly justified in order to take account of the particular bond between a mother and her child during the first year of the child's life. That's the first case on this. The third case, a Russian case, ruled that it's in the public interest to exempt female offenders from life imprisonment because of a general rule due to the needs of women for protection against gender-based violence, abuse, and sexual harassment in the prison environment. And I think this is an important ruling, a recognition by the court that this is the reality of life, and women need special arrangements to protect them. The second of these cases is a fairly long established one, but has been reinforced in the last few years, about decisions to allow children to stay with their mothers in prison being based on the best interests of the child. And that, as I say, has been enshrined in the case law for some time. Next slide. So what about the reality on the ground? Well, the CPT, the committee that visits places of detention, has visited a number of women's prisons and places of detention over the last year or two. And if you look through those reports, you see some familiar problems which still need to be addressed. Problems when women and their children are being transferred to and from prisons, being subject to intimidation and verbal abuse by males if the transportation has both men and women, a lack of gender-specific medical screening when women are admitted to prison in Denmark, which is usually a progressive country. Lack of adequate staffing in Moldova, one male custody officer assigned to the surveillance post for women and men, which meant that for most of the time women could not seek assistance if they had needs that needed attention. A fairly big issue, I think, about the range of non-gender stereotyped purposeful activities. I think prison systems have made efforts to improve the range of activities that women can undertake, but they are often rather stereotyped, and so the CPT has been critical of that. That was in Spain. And a big issue in a number of European countries, that there are many women in prisons who, because of their experiences of abuse and trauma, have developed serious psychological problems that really mean that they cannot be treated properly in prisons and need to be in different environments, hospital or other healthcare settings. And finally, from this selection of CPT recommendations, the importance of not just fixing these individual problems, but trying to develop something in the way of an alternative prison policy for women, to look at this at a much bigger level, and certainly the CPT have argued for that in its visit to Catalonia in Spain. Next slide, please. I just wanted to mention a couple of examples of things that I saw when I evaluated the Norwegian grants reform program in Eastern Europe. On the right-hand side, there is a picture of a child's nursery in a prison, very bright, clean, nice place, but still very much part of a prison. On the left, there is a picture of a house, a 5-bedroom detached house that was purchased with the help of the Norwegian government a few kilometers away from the prison, and 5 women and their young children serve their sentences in this house. So they're not in the prison at all. And it is a very radical, I think, and welcome initiative that enables women to bring their children up until the age of 3 or 4 in a home rather than in a prison environment. There is closed circuit TV surveillance of the common areas by the prison within the house. There are limits to what women can do. There are no visits allowed, although the women are allowed to meet with relatives and families outside the home. They're allowed a fair amount of freedom. But this seems to me quite a positive model that other countries, such as in Lithuania, former Soviet state in the Baltics, and I found it very impressive. All of the women had succeeded, and when their children get to a certain age, as I understood it, they become, the women are considered for conditional release from the prison system altogether. Next slide, please. I'd just like to finish by saying a word about my own country, the United Kingdom, which is has a number of jurisdictions. In Scotland, in the northern part of the United Kingdom, there is a plan. Initially, there was going to be a plan for a big new women's prison. And a lot of people said, actually, we don't really want that. It isn't the right way of complying with the Bangkok Rules and other standards. So there is going to be a new national facility to try and meet the needs of women that do need to be detained, but there are going to be a number of community custody units, which are much more smaller, based in the community, less restrictive, and will provide the sort of gender-specific and consistent trauma-informed environments that women need. But in order for that to work, there needs to be a reduction in the number of women imprisoned. And that is an area where, so far, there has been a struggle to get the numbers down. Similarly, in England and Wales, there is a strategy to try and, first of all, reduce the number of women that come into the criminal justice system at all, and of those to try and reduce those that end up going to prison, particularly for short prison terms. And in a way, if that can be done, that can pave the way to improving better conditions for those in custody. I should just say the important role that civil society has played in pushing for improvements in the way women in prison are dealt with. There is an important initiative called One Small Thing in the UK, which is trying to promote trauma-informed approaches, trying to promote an approach which is based on empathy and compassion and respect for women. And it's summed up in the idea that rather than asking people in prison, what have you done? You ask the question, what has happened to you? Because we know that so many of the women that find themselves in prison have been themselves victims of one sort or another. Next slide, please. Just a word about COVID. This is a picture of some shipping containers that have been modified to provide COVID-sensitive accommodation in the grounds of a prison. You might say, well, they look quite good, but the alternative really that hasn't properly been considered was to release more women. There was a plan to have a reduction in the prison population generally and women in particular, but it hasn't amounted to much. And I suppose that's the final message, and it echoes what the previous speakers have said, that really for the Bangkok Rules to be fully implemented in Europe, we need a concerted effort to reduce the numbers of women in prison. Final slide, please. And a few weeks ago, the government announced in England and Wales that there was going to be an increase in the number of prison places, 500 new prison places. And there was this article in one of the newspapers: to expand women's prisons is idiotic and inhumane. We should phase them out. Well, it's a rather brutal way of putting it, but I think at the end of the day, this is perhaps where we should be looking to go over the next 10 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob, for your very comprehensive and nuanced presentation. And we all have learned a lot from the European experience. Very comprehensive presentation indeed. I'm sure that many of us will like to discuss with you more. But in interest of the time, I would like to move on to our next speakers. We have pre-recorded a video message from two speakers, Ms. Coletta Youngers and Ms. Natasha Robert. Very brief introduction. Ms. Coletta is a senior fellow with the Washington Office of Latin America and a senior associate with the International Quality Consortium, IUPC. She has vast experience working on human rights and drug policy in Latin America. As for Ms. Natasha Roberts, she is the founder of an organization called La Boussole, which seeks to reduce the violence and stigma faced by those in prison from an intersectional perspective. In other words, regardless of age, gender, social class, and nationality. And her organization engages in prison and other class programs to build personal resilience and advocacy to prison reduced use of prison in Latin America. Without further ado, I would ask the host to play the video from these two ladies, please.
Thailand Institute of Justice for inviting me to this session. I'm a senior fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America, a senior associate with the International Drug Policy Consortium, and I'm also a member of Penal Reform International's Advisory Committee. For nearly a decade now, my work is focused on issues related to women in incarceration. And that work, with many years of documenting the impact of U.S. drug policies on human rights in Latin America. In the Americas, excessively harsh and punitive drug laws have fueled the region's prison crisis with a disproportionate impact on women. Simply put, we are filling our prisons with people who've committed low-level offenses for extremely long periods of time, leading to prisons bursting at the seams. Even before the COVID pandemic struck, prisons in Latin America were characterized by extreme overcrowding, inhumane living conditions, extremely inadequate access to food, potable water, healthcare, and the like, all of which has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And women continue to be put behind bars in facilities designed for men, sometimes with their infants or small children. The use of alternatives to incarceration is the rule, not the exception. And across the region, re-entry or social reintegration programs are woefully inadequate. Unfortunately, Latin America does not offer many examples of best practices for implementing the Bangkok Rules. In the short time that I have, I'm going to first talk about the growing number of women in prison, and then talk about the ways in which drug laws undermine the implementation of the Bangkok Rules. Then I will turn it over to my colleague Natasha, who will speak from the perspective of having been directly impacted by incarceration. The continued increase in the size of the female prison population is alarming. And while in sheer numbers more men are incarcerated than women, the rate of women being put behind bars in Latin America is growing much faster than that of men. Since the early 2000s, the number of women in prison has continued to skyrocket. For example, in El Salvador, over the last 2 decades, the number of women in prison increased by more than 670%. In El Salvador, over the last in Paraguay by more than 300%, followed by Ecuador at 283% and Brazil at 268%. Not only are these statistics greater than those for men, harsh drug laws are putting more women than men behind bars in terms of percentages. So in the case of men, we generally find that anywhere from 20 to 30% of the male prison population is there for drug offenses. In the case of women, it tends to be 40 to 80% of the female prison population. Data compiled by WOLA shows that in Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Panama, and Peru, the proportion of women prisoners who are incarcerated for drug offenses is at least 30% higher than that of the case of men. Moreover, the excessive use of pretrial detention is a primary factor contributing to the over-incarceration of women. Our research shows that more women than men are in pretrial detention for drug offenses in almost all of the countries we studied. The majority of these women are engaged in low-level offenses. They may be transporting drugs within a city, within the country, sometimes across borders. They may be selling small quantities of drugs out of their homes or on the street corner. But their incarceration does absolutely nothing to disrupt the drug trade. But it has devastating consequences, not only for these women, but for their families and their communities. So turning now to the Bangkok Rules, we recently co-produced a report that was written by the International Drug Policy Consortium titled Punitive Drug Laws, 10 Years Undermining the Bangkok Rules. For time reasons, I'm only going to point to just 3 of the rules covered in our report. Bangkok Rule 57 calls for gender-specific options for diversionary measures and pretrial and sentencing alternatives. Similarly, Bangkok Rule 58 says that women should not be separated from their families without due consideration given to their backgrounds and family ties, again calling for the use of diversionary measures whenever appropriate. Yet drug laws automatically characterize a broad range of what are considered to be drug offenses as serious, which usually prevents the use of alternatives to incarceration, mandates pretrial detention either in law or in practice, and establishes high mandatory minimum sentences. Drug laws often stipulate that those sentenced cannot take advantage of early release programs or other benefits. The options for diversion prior to entering the criminal legal system are practically non-existent, and sentencing alternatives are usually only considered for pregnant women and mothers, and again on a very, very limited scale. As a result, Bangkok Rules 57 and 58 are not being applied for most women behind bars in Latin America. Bangkok Rule 61 says that when sentencing women, courts shall have the power to consider mitigating factors such as lack of a criminal record, nature of the offense, and the woman's caretaking responsibilities. Yet again, we see that punitive drug laws consistently undermine the application of this rule. Given the drug laws in place today, judges are not able to take into account mitigating circumstances, such as poverty, drug dependency, women who have suffered from trauma and abuse, or even coercion, which constitute the vast majority of women incarcerated for drug offenses in the region. To conclude, Latin America has a long way to go to implement the Bangkok Rules. The pandemic has shone a spotlight on the horrific conditions in the region's prisons. Yet even that has not led to a significant reduction in prison populations. This 10-year anniversary should provide a wake-up call to governments to urgently implement reforms to dramatically reduce the number of women behind bars. And I'll turn it over now to my colleague Natasha, who is speaking to us from Mexico City.
Very good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation in the Crime Congress. My name is Natasha Louvet. I'm a French citizen, and I've been incarcerated for 10 years in a prison of Mexico City for a drug offense. I have been released since almost 4 years now. I got married inside the prison, and my wife and I created an organization, La Boussole, which looks for a world free of violence through arts and demonstration, and give to women from any type of community tools to get a path of life on the side of violence, drugs, and prison stay. As well as, through our own experience, we want to draw attention on the authorities on a deep change of policies and public politics, which literally destroy communities and per se all the society. My way out of prison as a foreigner was rude, and the government structure for women who come out from prison is poor or simply does not exist. All incarcerated people and his families know that the minimum rules for the treatment for prisoners are mainly not respected in all Latin American prisons. The Bangkok Rules are simply ignored. As I have experienced life in prison for 10 years, as well as working in close cooperation with other formerly incarcerated women in Latin America since have been released, we observed that the access to legal device of the Bangkok Rule number 2, taking legal action from the Bangkok Rule 7, are impossible to access for a lack of information and authorities' collaboration, and the risk of retaliation, which is today with the pandemic restriction inside the prison, higher than ever. The rule number 12, individualized, gender-sensitive, trauma-informed, and comprehensive mental health care and rehabilitation program shall be made available for women prisoners with mental health care needs in prison only on non-custodial setting. I've never seen and heard ever that there is an individual and progressive treatment applied on women arriving and staying in prison. In all Latin American, women suffer a mass treatment which do not let them send their personal trauma and past and may prepare their own life project and reintegration to the outside society. The Bangkok Rules number 26, 27, and 28 concerning the contact with the outside world totally disappeared from the panorama. Due to the pandemic, most of the incarcerated women in Latin America do not receive any visits since March 2020, and they haven't met their direct parents and children that they used to see at least once a week before the pandemic. The moral damages are huge. Women must get their children out of prison for the absence of economy due to the prohibition of the visits. Bangkok Rules 6-7, efforts shall be made to organize and promote comprehensive, results-oriented research on the offenses committed by women, the reason that triggers women's confrontation with the criminal justice system, the impact of secondary criminalization and imprisonment on women, etc. Number 6.8, the effect on the children. Number 6.9, efforts shall be made to review, evaluate, and make public periodically the trends, problems, and factors associated with offending behavior in women and the effectiveness in responding to the social reintegration needs of women offenders, etc. In some part of the world, it has been well done, especially in Latin America through WOLA and other NGOs. And now it's on the way to be done too from the formerly incarcerated women themselves. It looks like that the reports and numbers are not horrific and strong enough to impact and provoke a change in governmental actions. Regarding the Bangkok Rule number 70, which called to raising public awareness, sharing information, and training. It seems that what's happening, what's media does, is going against the divulgation of good practices, promoting the severest policies from the state, but maintain the stigmas on women offenders, their children, and entire families, as well as ignoring the failed public policies in all Latin American countries. I'm asking myself, what do we have to celebrate? At least we can celebrate that the problematic is well observed and investigated. So let's wish that the implementation of the Bangkok Rules becomes stronger and better known from the Latin American citizens in conflict with law, and hopefully invites for a change starting from the governments in correcting their policies to avoid women feeling of the prison. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I believe we have heard the situation of the implementation of Bangkok Rules on several continents now. Let me move forward to the concluding presentation by Dr. Barbara Oben, who will be sharing with us her thoughts on the future of the Bangkok Rules. A very brief introduction of my dear friend. Dr. Barbara Oben is a practitioner and academic working on the topic of women and imprisonment for many years. I would like to add that she is also an official resident of TIJ. Working with us over the years, and she has been a very esteemed mentor of many of us here working for TIJ as well. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Barbara to share your thoughts on the future of this important discussion. Barbara, please.
Thank you very much, sir. Could we put up the slides? Well, I'm very happy to be here with all my colleagues near and far, and I think we should congratulate ourselves for managing the technology in these challenging times. My talk looks at the future of the Bangkok Rules, and it comes from 4 particular places. As we have seen from my wonderful colleagues' presentations, the Bangkok Rules have taken root in some places, and in other places they require much more vigilance. The picture, as Rob said, is mixed. So there is more to do to reach the promise of the Bangkok Rules. Next slide. I'm going to speak very briefly about 4 ways to expand the promise of the Bangkok Rules over the next 10 years. First, we need to confront the gender inequities within the prison systems. Could we have the next slide? I'll just keep talking. Again, I'll repeat. There's 4 steps I'm going to talk about in the time I have. First, we need to confront the gender equities within prison systems. Second, we need to protect all women in the criminal justice system from discrimination and disadvantage. Third, we need a re-emphasis on safety and dignity and respect in all areas of correctional practice. But as all of my colleagues say, we have our eye on a bigger prize, and that's the expansion of robust non-custodial measures and the decrease in the ever-rising numbers of women sent to prison throughout the world. My first point, by confronting gender inequities within the prison system, we have what's been called the discrimination of scale. Women are a minority overall in a system designed for men. We also know that any form of discrimination is disadvantage, and this disadvantage can lead to harms. We also know that gender inequality is intersectional. And by that, we mean that gender is only one of many identities or experience that can be treated unequally within the system. We know women of color, women from minority communities, women with non-binary sexual identities, and a range of other characteristics are often even more harmed within the prison environment. And finally, we know that violence against women is based on these inequalities. So taken together, we see how inequity and inequality within the prison system disadvantages women. So in my view, that's our first step in the future of the Bangkok Rules. Next slide. My next argument is that we need to protect all women from discrimination and disadvantage. We know that there's inequality among the women inside. For women who speak the national language, for women who have families, for women who have some education, they can learn to navigate the complexities of the prison world. But what about women who have other challenges? Challenges of age. And I think we're on the next slide, if you could bring it up. The challenges of age, the challenges of physical and mental health, the challenges of literacy. When we look at the non-majority groups that we find in our prison populations, we know language and culture go hand in hand with race and ethnicity in producing disadvantage for women who should be in our care. We don't talk about it as much as we should, but non-binary gender identity and non-conventional sexuality is often punished within our prison systems. And as the final example, we know foreign nationals also experience discrimination and disadvantage. So the second point, protecting all women from discrimination and disadvantage, I think is something we ought to work extra hard on in the next 10 years. My third point is emphasizing safety and dignity in all areas of practice. We know from global research that women in prison are often subjected to gender-based violence, often at the hands of the very people who are supposed to care for them. So we understand that this violence is one of our critical issues that require emphasis in the next 10 years. As part of that, I see we need to expand definitions of safety beyond physical and include sexual, emotional, and other forms of safety. Next slide. So when we emphasize safety, we recognize a common fact found around the world. Conventional security for women creates gendered harms. The next 10 years should see work in minimizing the harm embedded in conventional practice, minimizing the harm embedded in operational practice that's been designed for the behavior of men. Gender-sensitive prison management and trauma-responsive operational practice are two ways to address this. And this includes policy review, staff training in trauma and behavior, like Rob mentioned in the UK initiative, and exploration of different ways to discipline women. So emphasizing safety, I believe, is critical to expanding the protections of Bangkok Rule. As we see in the next slides, we also should look toward an emphasis on dignity. And as we see in the next slide, further attention to privacy, hygiene needs, clothing, respectful speech and interactions with staff, better community-based pregnancy and postpartum care, and also gender-sensitive strip searches will go a long way in emphasizing the dignity that's missing in so many of our prisons now. In the next slide, I echo Dr. Kitty Pung's call to use the Bangkok Rules as a springboard to look at the system of criminal justice for women as a whole. So in the next slide, I talk about the need to develop robust non-custodial measures. As Coletta and her colleague mentioned, the punitive drug laws worldwide have undermined the ability and the application of the Bangkok Rules. I think we all need to acknowledge the gendered harms of imprisonment. We know that prison harms women in ways very different than it harms men. As my prior colleagues have mentioned, we have worldwide an over-reliance and over-investment in prisons. Instead of prisons being the last resort, in many countries, particularly for women, prisons are the first resort. The report on how drug laws undermine the Bangkok Rules makes this point very well. And I see that Gloria has posted a link to this report. I urge you all to read it because it expands the purview of the Bangkok Rules. It expands the way we think of it beyond the prison. Non-custodial measures are based on the principle of least restrictive custody. We need to analyze the ways in which we hold women in prisons that are overbuilt and over-disciplined for the type of behavior they show. We know that non-custodial measures can meet the goals of accountability. They can meet the goals of punishment while minimizing the gendered harms of imprisonment. Just like Rob's note that in some countries people are saying we need to keep women out of prison because we haven't been able to protect them while they were in our custody. And finally, non-custodial measures align with the lower level of risk presented by women. In the next slide, we see the evidence for non-custodial measures. We know that external services combined with therapies and treatment opportunities support internal change. These two things, again, the next slide, external services and internal change produces the strongest outcome in terms of pro-social behavior, decreased problematic behaviors, and overall success in supervision. So if we could skip to the last slide, or to the next slide. I assert the time is now to invest in human rights protections through non-custodial measures. As Rob pointed out, we need to fight this on two particular fronts. Reducing the number of women in prison was a point made by every presenter here today. We have to use non-custodial measures and other alternatives to stop this ever-increasing flow of women into prisons. And we also need to use the Bangkok Rules to improve prison conditions, to improve them for women who are marginalized within the prison, as well as the rest of the population. So the future of the Bangkok Rules, to me, is leadership and messaging, TIJ and many of the other organizations on this call have taken the lead in broadcasting the message of non-custodial measures and gender-sensitive management. We also know that policy development, both internal to the prison operations, but equally important outside in drug laws and other sentencing platforms. We know that training, and of course, as a researcher, I have to say research are the way to ensure a future of the Bangkok Rules that does the 4 things I've outlined. Collaboration is equally important, a collaboration outside the prison system and with many of the ministries and agencies that produce sentencing policy. I feel that the future of the Bangkok Rules is an investment in the human rights protections and all forms of capital through non-custodial measures. Next slide. So again, I'm going to conclude and say the time is now to invest in the suggestions my colleagues made and the 4 suggestions I make to both improve conditions inside, but with the larger goal, with the larger reach for decreasing the number of women who come into the prison system. Thank you very, very much for this opportunity to share my thoughts with you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for your presentation. And that concludes our presentation that we have in our meeting. Let me begin by asking anyone who would like to address any particular panelist or to raise any questions. Now is the time. We have about 7 minutes to do so. The floor is please. You can either raise your hand or you could type in questions. I believe we have about 30 people in the room, and we have heard fascinating accounts and insights from various parts of the world. And to me, progress as well as challenges are very educational and something that we can benefit from by looking at the situation and appreciating the difficulty and its response. Anyone would like to raise your hand? Please do so. I'm also checking with my team to see if I missed any questions or comments. No? So far I have seen none. So if I may, I am also very curious about the last point that Barbara has made about the need to collaborate. Oh, you do? We do.
Yes. Not a question, but comment of appreciation. My name is Yumi Aono, working as a director of Training Institute of Japanese Corrections. I have been in Bangkok on the first expert meeting for the female standards. That was a great opportunity for me. And I'd like to say thank you for Dr. Kittipong and Justice Ministry of Thailand and its initiative for this Bangkok Rule. That's all.
Thank you very much, Ms. Aono. It's indeed a great honor to reunite with you, and you are one of the pioneers that made today's possible. Thank you very much for sharing your comments with us. Next, I have George Onstead raising his hand. May I ask the host to allow George to address the panelists with his questions? Thank you.
We're working on giving him permission to speak right now.
Yeah, good morning or whatever part of today, if I'm there. Just a quick appreciation to all the presenters. This was a fantastic session, and I particularly have to say I welcome some of the information that Rob provided from the European context. I think there are a lot of things from those cases and recommendations that we can take elsewhere. Just one question for the panelists, though, who are all experts on the Bangkok Rules. Obviously, they're designed as a supplement to the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. But we've heard a lot, and we hear a lot about training on the Bangkok Rules themselves. I'm wondering, do you think it's really possible to train on the Bangkok Rules in isolation if you haven't first trained officers on the standard minimum rules? Because there's such a lot that's taken for granted as being in the SMR that's then not included in the Bangkok Rules. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, George. Any presenters would like to address on this particular topic that has been raised by George?
I'll answer that.
All right. Please, Barbara.
At least on my end, there's about a 20-second delay, so I feel a little out of time here. The training that I've had the privilege of working with TIJ and the Bangkok Rules does, I think, a very good job of contextualizing the Bangkok Rules, both within the larger framework now that we have the Mandela Rules, as well as in the application of the rules to operational practice. So I feel that we do talk about the larger issues in the standard minimum rules as now enshrined in the Mandela Rules, but we'll take your comment into consideration when we design the next training session.
Thank you very much, Barbara. No, I don't see any further questions, and in the interest of time, I think we are right on time. So I'm afraid this will be the conclusion of our ancillary meeting. Before I go, please allow me to thank all the distinguished panelists for their invaluable contribution. Thank you very much, all participants who joined our meeting today, and also special thanks to our host and our technical team, both in Kyoto and in Bangkok. I really appreciate it, and I really look forward to being able to meet with some of you, or maybe all of you in person in the near future. Now I would like to conclude this meeting, and I wish you a very pleasant day, pleasant evening, and bye-bye.